May it please the court. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Please tell us your name
Jose Saldana,
and where are you from?
New York.
Can you tell us your personal history of your involvement with the criminal justice system?
I am formerly incarcerated. I was released from prison in 2018 after 38 years of incarceration.
And during that time of incarceration, did you experience any personal violations of your own rights?
Absolutely. I did my first 8 years in federal prison system where I was gassed a number of times, and I was also put in what they call the hole. In the state system where I did 30 years, I was put in the box, called the box in New York State. A number of times I was also have 3 altercations with correction officers.
And did you ever get any redress for those violations?
Absolutely none.
Do you believe that your race had anything to do with those violations?
Not only my race, but the crime that I was convicted of.
So in combination?
Yes.
And in what way did the items that got you in the hole, in what way was race a part of that?
Well, we're talking about a systemic institution that is infested with racism, and that any resistance to their law and order will be met by brutality. And that, in essence, was what's happening with me. Whenever they thought I was involved in any kind of organizing among the incarcerated men, you know, I will feel the lash of the state or the federal government.
Your Honors, at this time, I'm going to take a line of questioning to establish his credibility also as an expert witness in addition to his personal testimony. So during the time of your incarceration, did you belong to organizations where you analyzed the conditions of confinement and mass incarceration, including race?
Yes, in the federal system as well as the state. But I think it was in the state that I really developed into the person that I am today. A new movement was being developed across New York State prison system. It was called the non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice. And it was founded by 2 pioneers, Larry White and Eddie Ellis. And I became a student of this movement. And this helped me develop not only the insight, but it gave me the lens to actually make connections with what was going on, what I was seeing up front, and what has happened throughout history.
So if I put out the words race, mass incarceration, can you give an example of one of the lessons that you took from that early formation while you were inside?
Mass incarceration. I actually see the face of mass incarceration. And that face is grandfathers, fathers, sons, brothers. We can also apply it to grandmothers and mothers and daughters, all scattered across New York State prison system. Just imagine that, and imagine the devastation that this would do to the family structure and then to the community. So the face of mass incarceration is to eliminate vital parts of families, from families and communities. And this, to me, was devastating. Actually seeing that this is what was happening and equating it to what happened during the chattel slave history. And then understanding that my children also went through this.
And when were you released from incarceration?
2018.
And did a time come after that that you became the executive director of an organization?
One of the principles that we learned in non-traditional approaches, as well as the other courses and approaches that I was a part of, is that we have to develop and embrace a moral obligation to give back, a moral obligation to speak against this system or do something to dismantle it. I left prison with that principle in my conscience, that I was not going to leave prison and just pursue my personal life as if the men I left behind did no longer exist. I was going to leave prison with the determination that I would not only speak against this system, but I would do something to dismantle it.
And what was the name of the organization that you became the executive director of?
I became the executive director of RAPP, the Release Aging People in Prison Campaign, 10 months after I was released. And for those who don't know, RAPP seeks the vision of ending mass incarceration and promoting racial justice through the release of aging people in prison and those serving long-term prison sentences as a means of uprooting the legacy of racism that dominates the New York State legal system.
And what were the qualifications that you had to have in order to be given this position?
Qualification wasn't really specified, but I believe that the RAPP Collective confirmed my nomination when the lead director was dying. It was his dying wish that I succeed him, and they confirmed it based on my history of 38 years of being in the fight in the prison system, and then coming out and jumping right into the fight for freedom, not only of those who are incarcerated, but to eliminate the actual systemic racism that dominates every institution in our country and in New York State. I think they've seen that, and they confirmed my nomination as a result of what they see.
So as part of your duties, did you have a chance to review reports that were posted on the RAPP website, such as from Columbia University, the Sentencing Project?
Columbia University just put out a report which actually just confirmed what I've seen over the decades of incarceration. You know, they mentioned that 700 people have died in the New York State prison system in the last 10 years. All 700 of them were 50 years or older. And 75 to 85% of them were Black or brown. That's not surprising. What may surprise people, because it surprised me, is that the average age of death was 58 years old. My experience is most of my friends who died while I was in prison were either in their late 50s or 60 or 61. If they weren't brutally beaten by security, they died as a result of medical negligence.
So have you formed opinions about the system of mass incarceration, based on your years of personal experience and the expertise that you got within the organization inside, as well as the expertise that you brought to RAPP?
Yes, watching men, actually 16, 17-year-old kids, languish in prison for 30, 35 years. And coming in at that young age, we're talking about brown and Black kids coming in at that age by the dozens, and some dying, never returning back to their families. To me, I saw this as neo-genocide, because if it was happening to white kids at the level that it was happening to Black and brown kids, there would be a public uproar. People would start talking about science, how their brains weren't fully developed, but it was happening to Black kids, brown kids. To me, this is neo-genocide.
So are you familiar with the Convention on Genocide?
Yes, I am.
So what's the one word that you use when it comes to the word genocide? What's the term that you have coined for it?
I don't understand the question.
I'm trying to ask it without telling you what the answer is. I know that there is a word that you have used, a form of genocide, a newer form of genocide. That's a word you use.
I refer to it as neo-genocide because it's subtle. It's not as brutal as the genocide we're accustomed to seeing in history. But this is so subtle that if you're not actually in the face of the storm, you might miss it and you might not make the connections. It's definitely a new form of genocide, but it's just as devastating and it's just as annihilating to the people that are targeting.
So I'm going to take you past the subtleties. Let's cut right to the chase. And I'm going to go through the elements of genocide. And what I would like you to do is state your belief after I ask the question, and then give an example that goes along with your belief. Do you believe that the U.S. federal, state, and local government incarceration system violates the Geneva Convention by killing Black and brown people?
Absolutely, when the highest office in our country labels black and brown kids as super predators, he is putting a target on their back.
Do you believe that the U.S. federal, state, and local government incarceration system violates the Geneva Convention by causing serious mental and bodily harm?
Absolutely, and I want to speak about the mental. During the mass incarceration period, until today, people are languishing in the box for decades. Solitary confinement for decades. I have a co-defendant who has been in solitary confinement for nearly 25 years now.
Do you believe that the U.S. federal, state, and local government incarceration system violates the Geneva Convention by deliberately inflicting on black and brown people conditions calculated to bring about their physical demise?
Yes. Brutality in the New York State prison system equals the brutality and murder outside in our societies of black and brown people.
Do you believe that the U.S. federal, state, and local government incarceration system violates the Geneva Convention by imposing measures intended to prevent births of black and brown people?
The people right now coming to prison in New York State, the group of women. Imagine that. Women are the highest people being incarcerated now. And I suspect that it's all across the state. Once they start incarcerating women, they're actually trying to eliminate us.
Do you believe the U.S. federal, state, and local government incarceration system violates the Geneva Convention by forcibly transferring black and brown children to another group?
Well, they're transferring them to prisons across the state of New York, and they're languishing there for decades, and some of them are dying.
Do you believe the U.S. federal, state, and local government incarceration system violates the Geneva Convention by conspiring to commit the acts that we described above?
The highest office labeled our children predators and then funded the states to create more prisons for them. That's a conspiracy.
Excuse me, pardon the interruption. We have a text from the Chief Judge. Did you want to go on and raise it? Okay, thank you. Thank you.
My salute to you. The jurors want to ask you, what were you incarcerated for?
I was convicted for attempt murder of a New York City police sergeant who was on patrol in Harlem.
Okay. Do you believe that you have had a just process?
No. The theory of prosecution against me was that the shooting was unprovoked. They shot me first. Returned fire. I believe that I was justified in returning fire.
So you were exercising your right to self-defense?
But there is no self-defense law in New York State against police officers.
Okay.
But if I didn't return fire, I wouldn't be here today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the questions, Your Honors. Last question. Do you believe that the U.S. federal, state, and local government incarceration system violates the Geneva Convention by having the required intent to commit the acts that we talked about above?
Yes.
And I know it'll be up to our jurors to decide a remedy, but what do you think should happen to this incarceration system?
We may not have the power, or the UN may not have the power, but the only solution is dismantle this entire system, and reparations on the most massive scale known in human history should be done.
Thank you, Your Honors. No further questions. I should have made my appearance when I first came up here. My name is King Downing on behalf of the people.
Thank you.
Attorney Jaribu Hill, you may begin with your direct examination of this witness.
Thank you, Chief Counsel Nkechi Taifa. To all of my brothers and sisters, comrades and colleagues, and most especially to our distinguished jurist, I am Jaribu Hill, human rights attorney from the Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights that was established in 1996 to address human rights wrongs in Mississippi workplaces and the suffering of Black workers and other oppressed, not only workers, but other oppressed people within the state of Mississippi. And I know that I don't really have to go deep into the history, for most of you certainly know. Appreciate the reference earlier to Emmett Till and Mamie Till and onward with getting justice for Emmett Till. Today, I am charged with the delightful opportunity to guide you through the story of our brother Saleem Holbrook, who has an amazing story, an amazing history of struggle and resistance, no compromising, and truth-telling. And so welcome, Brother Saleem, Executive Director Saleem Holbrook. Welcome.
Thank you.
And at this time, before we actually get into the work of sharing your story as both an abolitionist and a revolutionary scholar and thinker and activist, I'd like you to first just tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? What's your birthplace?
I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, North Philly. Was born in 1974.
And you are currently executive director of an organization, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Can you tell us the name of the organization and a bit about the mission of the organization?
Yes, I'm the executive director of the Abolitionist Law Center. The Abolitionist Law Center. The Abolitionist Law Center is a dismantling law project. It was born out of the Human Rights Coalition, which is an organization that was co-founded by myself, Curry Shakabuna Marshall, Russell Maroon Schultz, and about a dozen other prisoners in solitary confinement in Pennsylvania. It was composed of our family members and many of the attorneys and staff who are at the Abolitionist Law Center started off as volunteers and activists for the Human Rights Coalition back in 2001 when we started. So we've been doing this for a while.
And what is the primary reason why the organization was formed?
I mean, the Abolitionist Law Center was founded to address the race and class-based discrimination in this system, but also the disregard and the abuse that Black life faces in America, Black and brown life faces in America, particularly Black youth who are caught up in the criminal justice system. And well, for me personally, my experience guides the Abolitionist Law Center's work, because as someone who at the age of 16 years old was facing a death sentence and was sentenced to spend the rest of my life in prison, ultimately served 27 years in prison, 10 of those in solitary confinement. The longest I spent consecutively was 3 years. Our work was born out of that experience, but more importantly, not just my experience, because I don't want to just center myself, but it was born out of the experience of political prisoners in Pennsylvania, because it was political prisoners when I was buried in that hole, me and other children who came through, when we were being preyed upon, it was political prisoners who embraced us, who protected us, who built us up, in many cases became our fathers. And so for me, that guides our work, right? Because to come home and be released and forget about them who helped us at our lowest moments, that's something that, you know, as a human being, I just was not raised like that, and they did not raise us like that. So I do want to center them, you know, in my experience, because had it not been for Russell Maroon Schultz, who is presently dying of stage 4 cancer right now, a political prisoner in Pennsylvania, and who was denied compassionate release by a judge, who was denied the opportunity to go home to his family and close his eyes with his family surrounding him, not a bunch of guards, not shackled to a hospital bed, to die with dignity, because I know that there's no dignity in death in prison. He was an inspiration for our work, right? So when I say we're a dismantling project, I don't mean that, I don't take that lightly. You know, we meet the state where they're at. We're willing to fight just as hard as they are against us, because that's the regime that we come out. That's our experiences. And I would like to live in a society one day where there's no need for an abolitionist law center, right? That's what we're working for. But as long as we have oppression, racism, as long as we have Black youth being murdered in the street, Black youth being sentenced to die in prison, and brown youth and women, there's going to be a need for an abolitionist law center, and people who are going to fight as hard as we fight, inspired and motivated by the legacy of Black resistance and political prisoners in this country.
Well, thank you for your statement. Thank you so much for clarifying and letting us know exactly why there is an abolitionist law center. Now, the word abolition it's certainly scary. I know it was scary for the slave masters, and I don't imagine it's any less scary today to actually talk about abolition. Can you, for the benefit of the jurists who are going to be unpacking your testimony and looking into the substance and text of your testimony, can you tell us what your understanding is, or what your definition is of abolition?
I mean, for me, it's clear cut. When you have a system that was founded on exploitation, that was founded on genocide, and its legacy continues today, I don't think there's any alternative but abolition. I think that we have tried for centuries, and in my lifetime, I've seen this for decades. I've seen us try and reform this system, right? In 2020, we all witnessed national uprisings against police violence, against police murder, extrajudicial murder in this country. However, that uprising was nothing new. We saw it in the 1960s. We saw it in 1980 in Liberty City. We saw it in 1992 in Los Angeles. We could go back to the riots of 1919, and we could go back further. This is an epidemic in this country that we have been dealing with for generations. It's unfortunately that I had to experience this when political prisoners and movements 30, 40, and 50 years ago were fighting against this system and the abuses that it brings upon us. And for me, the common theme and even a common failure that I see is that when you look at all of the after action reports, when you look at all the government reports, all of the city reports, all of them trot out the same tired reforms that were trotted out the last time there was an uprising, the last time there was a riot, the last time we felt the need to have to take to the streets and set something on fire or overturn something so that this country could not respect our lives, because it has shown that it's never going to do that, but to respect our pain, or at least see our pain. When you see all these reforms and you see it's just the same thing, you have to come to two realizations: either as a community or a movement or a nation, we're insane because we keep doing the same thing over and over, or that this tactic is failed and now we have to push further for abolition, because you can't reform it. And I hope that 20 years from now, or maybe even 5 years from now, when there's a next national uprising and the world sees this, that we're not in the same position where we're talking about banning chokeholds, having police cameras on officers, more money to police officers, better training. I don't know how many trainings I've sat through or listened to, until we realize that it's the system that needs to be abolished. I think that we're going to be facing the same oppression and the same heartache and the same pain as a people.
Thank you so much for that. And in the interest of time, Mr. Saleem Holbrook does have an extensive biographical description of some of his work, some of the organizations, and some of the writings that he has created that have been published through Turnout and other publication arms. We want to make sure that we move the entire bio into the record so that if there are certain documents, including articles that need to be footnoted and referenced, they can be done so at that time. Now, as we move on, because I know our time is running out, I'd like you just to, for a moment, take yourself back to 1991. What actually happened to you? You mentioned earlier that you and so many others went into the system as children. Tell us what happened to you in 1991.
Well, I was arrested in 1990. I was sentenced in 1991. But, you know, when I was 16 years old, I was involved in a drug-related homicide. I was a 16-year-old lookout. I did not kill the victim. I did not strike the victim. I didn't even see the victim being killed, but I had to reach a stage in my life where if I tell this story, I have to acknowledge at least my responsibility in a human being's death, even though I was not the perpetrator of it. So I do want to take a moment for that space whenever I, reflect back on that night, what happened. I was a lookout to a homicide. I was subsequently arrested. 2 weeks after my arrest, when I was at the Youth Study Center on the 5th floor of security, a platoon of guards came down to my cell door. I was sitting on my bed. It was in the afternoon. They opened the door. About 6 of them stepped in. They had an envelope in their hand. They opened the envelope in front of me, handed me a clipboard to sign. I signed it. They handed me the paper. They turned around and walked out the cell. I looked down, opened up. It was a letter from the district attorney's office, and it was telling me that the state was filing capital charges against me, and if I was convicted, I would be subjected to the death sentence. So 16 years old, that's my first contact with the United States justice system. I just sat on my bed trying to figure out what this meant. Fortunately, I was not sentenced to death. However, the state did sentence me to die in prison. I was sentenced to life without parole. Mandatory sentencing required that the judge could not take into consideration my culpability or my actual participation in the offense, but the fact that I knew that someone was being killed and stayed there, that was enough not to just get me subjected to spending the rest of my life in prison, but being sentenced to death, which I was fortunate to avoid. Only because I agreed to plead guilty to a lesser degree of murder and put my fate in the hand of a judge. Had I not did that, I would have, if I would have been convicted of first-degree murder, I would have faced a death sentence. So I was sentenced to life without parole. I was fortunate in 2020 that the United States Supreme Court ruled that children could not be sentenced to mandatory life without parole sentences, and I was eligible for a resentencing hearing, which I had tremendous community support. Even the judge that sentenced me wrote a letter and saying, had I had any discretion in sentencing him, I would have never sentenced him to life without parole. The tragedy is, though, that I'm not an exception. I'm not sitting up here telling my story as I'm something special. There were hundreds of us sentenced to life without parole. I was very fortunate that I was able to make it out. Many of us that I know didn't. Many of my friends hung themselves, killed themselves. Others were killed. I could think of one juvenile lifer, a friend of mine named John Carter. We used to call him J-Rock. In 2011, he was murdered at SCI Rockview because a prisoner had his food tray skipped over for the night, and J-Rock held his tray slot open to try and get the prisoner his meal for the night, and the guards tear gassed him to death in his cell. The unfortunate thing about that is he died 1 year after the United States Supreme Court decision of Miller that paved the way for us to be coming home. He could have benefited from that, but he was murdered by a correctional officer at the SCI Rockview because he was standing up for a prisoner who was denied his food. It was around the same time that Eric Garner died. In the uprisings. And I remember us feeling invisible on the inside because many of us were being abused, many prisoners were being killed, but there was no movement for us. And I remember us saying, like, when we get out, we're going to make sure that our voices are not just heard, but we're going to center our voices in spaces, regardless to who likes it or not. So, you know, I think of so many that didn't make it out, who were children, but I also think of ones who made it out, but left so much of themselves inside, who are home and went insane. Many of us lost lost a piece of our soul. You can't do 27 years in prison and think that you're coming home whole, right? Many of us were deprived the opportunity to have children, to raise families. So we lost a lot. I like to say that, you know, I paid my debt to the state. I gave them more and some. I don't owe the state anything. You know, if anything, I owe my community a debt, right? And many of us are coming out here with that mentality. So I do want to center that, not just in Pennsylvania, but in this country continues to sentence children to spend the rest of their lives in prison. This country continues to funnel thousands of Black and brown youth into the adult system, where you either have two choices, fight or die. And when I say die, I'm not just talking about a physical death. I'm talking about a spiritual. I'm talking about an emotional death, right? So it's two forms of deaths that you face in there as children. You experience that as adults, but as children, it's different. And this country continues to do it. The United States Supreme Court, just the decision that released me, with this Supreme Court that's in power now, they just rolled that decision back. So I was very fortunate, myself and hundreds of other children that were sentenced to life without parole in Pennsylvania, we were very fortunate to catch that window to get out, because that window has shut already. Pennsylvania has just restarted sentencing people to life without children or life without parole again. The United States is picking the practice back up. And that's an example too, that in the United States, victories won have to be held. We can't rest on our laurels, but also more importantly, that there is a higher law, and that's why there's a human rights law. These rights are inherent. And I was thinking of what Jose Saldana, you know, one of my comrades, and also someone that I look up to, when he talked about what happened to him, and he said in New York, there is no law of self-defense for shooting back against police. But I do want to say that human beings have an inherent human right to self-defense. And that's something that's really important, especially that when we're in this Autobahn, because this is where Malcolm X told us that civil rights has run its course. Civil rights are a narrow interpretation of our rights. And when we were in prison, when we were in solitary confinement, and Russell Maroon Schultz said, we're going to call our organization the Human Rights Coalition, he centered what Malcolm said to us. He said, because what we're going to be asking for is something that the state cannot give us or take us. These are our inherent human rights, our rights to self-determination, our rights to dignity, our rights to self-defense, our rights to self-reliance, our rights to develop as full human beings. And that's something that the state cannot take from us. But this country continues to strip Black and brown youth by the thousands, by the tens of thousands of those rights, by funneling them into adult prisons where they will either spend the rest of their lives or they will be so destroyed as human beings. It's essentially a civil death, because when they come home, I'm very fortunate that I had a movement around me that could support me. But it's not like this all around the country. There are many other formerly incarcerated children, and there's many people who are in prison who are children or were children that are suffering right now while we're speaking.
And thank you for bringing all of those who are victims of this repressive, exploitive, genocidal system. Thank you for bringing every last one of them, for doing your own personal roll call to lift up some of the names. And as we begin to wind down and close out the testimony, not because I want to, but I know that we do have a time issue, I would love it if you could tell the jurist and all of my brothers and sisters present at this tribunal, if you could share a little bit more about what life was like in the home. When you and I were talking last night, you clarified for me that that was the same thing as, or was synonymous with solitary confinement. And you mentioned a little while ago that you spent 10 years off and on in solitary confinement. You also last night talked about some of the other brothers who had been in solitary confinement. Can you talk about the conditions in solitary confinement and touch on a little bit the general conditions of confinement and why this whole issue of prisoners' rights is a human right? Because we can't rely on the US Constitution. We do have the 8th Amendment, which supposedly prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. But how cruel and unusual is it for someone to be relegated and subjected to solitary confinement for 10 years? Tell us about some of the others who were even subjected to this cruelty for longer periods of time, and lift up some of the names, if you will.
So the 8th Amendment, yeah, let's talk about the 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment in this country. The 8th Amendment allowed the state of Pennsylvania to keep Russell Maroon Schultz in solitary confinement for 30 years. The 8th Amendment allowed the state of Pennsylvania to keep Joseph Jojo Bowens continuously in solitary confinement for 34 years. The 8th Amendment allowed the state of Pennsylvania to keep Fred Muhammad Burton in solitary confinement for 19 years. The 8th Amendment in Pennsylvania allowed the state to keep Arthur Chetaway Johnson in continued solitary confinement for 39 years. All of these were political prisoners, and they were in the hole for a reason, because the state wanted to separate them from us, from other prisoners. I was, I hate to say that I was fortunate, but when I was in solitary confinement, I was fortunate to be put on the range with these men. And they were the ones that if you were young and you went back in the hole, if you went back into the hole and were put on the range with them, you were very fortunate because you knew that you were going to get an education, right? But the state did not want us to speak to them. The state did not want us to be them. Actually, the state was saying that if you want to be like them, this is they're the example for you. You will be in the hole for decades. But we rejected that model because they were giving us something. They were giving us life while the state was taking it. So it's like the state was strangling us and they were resuscitating us. So we was like, I'm going to go with what's giving me air, not with what's taking my life. But the experience, the only thing I can say about solitary confinement is every individual person's own particular hell. That's the best way of describing it. Like, it impacts people differently. It impacts people in their own way. You see some people that go inward and never come out because you tear yourself apart. You see some people that just project so much outward because they're gone mentally. But the conditions, look, you're in a cell in many of our cases with just a pair of boxers, a t-shirt. You might be lucky if you get flip-flops, a couple books, a sheet, toilet paper. And the remarkable thing I found about that is that I've been in a cell completely naked with nothing in that cell, and I would see a lieutenant come and look in that cell and stand there and figure out what more could he take? What more could they take? And it was in those moments that I realized that there's nothing else that you could take, right? That's the mentality that you have to survive. But if you don't have that mentality, that those are the people, unfortunately, who are going to take their life because they have reached that point. Every human being, I don't care who you are, has a breaking point, and then how you break is really going to depend on your experiences and at what level you break. And it's the people who are in those type of conditions are the ones who are going to kill themselves, are going to go so insane that they never come back. So, I would like to just go minutely into each particular form of hell that solitary confinement is, but I don't know if I have right now the mental space to do it, and we have the time. But what I could say is that solitary confinement in the United States is based on stripping people who already have nothing, finding what more can we take from you. And you have to be a remarkable human being to make it out of that experience and repair yourself, because you're going to be damaged. No doubt about it. You're going to be damaged. So that's what I'll say about solitary confinement. It's inhumane. And in the United States, it is common. It is part of the system. And, you don't have to be a political prisoner in the United States to spend years in solitary confinement. There's many of us have. So
thank you, Saleem. We can't thank you enough for your courage, for your profound understanding of the system of oppression, and for your everyday work to abolish that system, to dismantle that system of oppression. Genocide, International Tribunal 2021. Jurist, I offer you the testimony of Saleem Holbrook, a fighter, an abolitionist, a human rights defender. I also offer you his bio to share and learn from, and to visit some of his writings if you have the time. Saleem, it's been my honor to sit with you for these few minutes and to learn and to be inspired all over again by your revolutionary courage and the work. I wish you much success. I hope to see you in person at some point. I know that you have plans to visit us here in the state of Mississippi, and you will certainly be welcomed with open arms and hearts. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and an honor hearing from you today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, jurist, come to the microphone, please. And is the question for the witness that was just here? Mr. Holbrook, can you come back to the stand?
How did you get back your strength, your resilience, and your dignity, and address each of one of us with a confidence which has pierced our hearts, minds, and soul? How did you do it, even after all these years of trying to take your humanity, your resilience, and your dignity? How did you do it? And thank you so much for your courage.
Thank you, thank you. I didn't have to get it back because they never took it. I never allowed them to take it.
That said it all. Thank you so much for the question. These stories are so very, very heart-wrenching as we're into the midst of count 2 of mass incarceration. And we're going to continue at this point to hear a couple more personal stories. First from the Colorado detention immigrant detainees. And we will be following that with another video with the Colorado detention detainees. And then we are going to hear from the mother of the exonerated 5, one of the mothers of the exonerated 5, formerly known as the Central Park 5, Sister Sharonne Salaam. And we will then close out the mass incarceration. We're going to take a brief break after that and go right into our final count for today, count 3 on political prisoners. So we want to go on and key up the Zoom video dealing with the detention detainees, Laura Peniche. Kiara, you may begin the direct examination.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure, the video was here, but it cut out on our end. I'm not sure if you could see it either, Laura, but I just wanted to ask about that before we start. I'll continue just in case. Laura, would you feel comfortable introducing yourself and the work that you've done related to mass incarceration to everybody here today?
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Peniche. I'm the hotline manager with Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. I receive reports of detention and ICE activity in Colorado. I also coordinate with networks in resistance to immigrant detention across the Southwest and the country, such as Communities for Sheriff Accountability National Coalition.
Thank you. Would you say that your work with the hotline and the detention center has given you a specific insight into the incarceration system of the U.S.?
Absolutely. Our hotline is connected to the Colorado Rapid Response Network, which supports families resisting deportation in Colorado. But my work is mostly focused on documenting ICE activity as well as testimonies of collaborations between police and ICE. We also document testimonies of people who are in immigrant detention centers. After the murder of George Floyd, I started getting more involved in the police accountability work because that summer and that fall, we started getting heartbreaking testimonies through our hotline of folks who were reporting that they were actually agreeing with the Black Lives Matters movement because they themselves had also experienced injustice in the hands of police. And they had countless of many testimonies of folks who called police for help and instead were either abused, they were handed over to ICE, and then those stories were lost because they were deported before they had the chance to tell anyone what had happened to them. The most heartbreaking story that really haunts me is the story of a mother of 3 young children. She called the police one night because her husband was strangling her and about to kill her. She called for help. The police came to her and said, "Don't worry, everything's gonna be fine," but she didn't speak English. Her husband did speak English, therefore it was easy for him to change the story with the police, and they ended up taking no action, except the sheriff came back later that night because he realized that she didn't have documentation. So he came back, arrested her in the middle of the night, and she was deported just within 2 weeks of that police arrest. She was placed domestic violence charges, and her chances of seeing her children again were just broken by the police system.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are familiar with, the actions of ICE on an individual level and how it impacts just one person's life, but a big part of the genocide impact is how it impacts the community. Could you go into detail about how incidents like those have a ripple effect outside of a personal level and what it looks like on a community scale?
Yeah, to begin, it's necessary to say that immigration detention is the unjust practice of detaining immigrants while they await a determination of their immigration status or deportation. The system has grown to a system of over 200 jails and private prisons with the capacity to detain over 500,000 people per year. I just wanted to say that this is just a continuation of the racist history of immigration laws and policies that we've had in the US. For example, while the detention system has massively expanded since 2001, the United States has a long history of racist immigration and detention policies. These are specifically towards immigrants of color. Starting in 1790 with the first Naturalization Act, in which white people were granted citizenship based on good behavior, while Native Americans, enslaved people, indentured servants, free Blacks, and Asians were excluded. And we see this trend continue with Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s to the mass detention of Haitian refugees in concentration camps in the 1900s.
Are some of the people that are taken and held by ICE and even deported by ICE legal citizen, like quote legal citizens and citizens that were born here?
We have seen cases of people who were citizens and were unfortunately deported, as well as many veterans who served the country and have also been deported. But I think we also don't take into consideration the families that are left behind when someone is deported. I have taken testimonies of children who believe their father was murdered by police because they saw a bunch of armed men come into their house and snatch their father away from them, like right in front of their eyes. So this, the ripple effects of a deportation are huge on a family, which often has mixed statuses of citizens or residents.
Yeah, with that, like speaking about how children are impacted, could you speak to the mental, like the mental health issue that's related to incarceration, especially in the way that this incarceration is being completed, how people who aren't deported specifically can go on in our society, children, how they're supposed to go to school every day, like those effects from this singular incarceration event?
Yes, children cannot sleep at night. I've seen children crying out loud outside of immigrant detention centers because they don't have the chance to say goodbye to their father or mother one last time. Many of the families that we're working with, they have to take therapy and for years after this incident. Not to mention a mother who is left behind now has to be a mother and work 2 or 3 jobs in order to support the entire family. And these are the people on the outside. However, on people in the inside, we see, as you probably have seen in the news, there's a record and appalling abuse in ICE detention centers that can be comparable to concentration camps. There is reported medical neglect, sexual and physical abuse, excessive use of solitary confinement, especially for queer and trans migrants. There are reports of folks being tortured in order to force them to sign their own deportation order. Folks being transferred from one detention center to another detention center, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic. And I think the worst for me is when folks inside feel like they're in a death trap with COVID because they don't have the proper ventilation. They know there's COVID outbreaks inside the detention centers, but there's nothing they can do. They don't have social distance. Sometimes they don't get proper supplies like masks. And these are all things that when I see people being released from the immigrant detention center, they speak of how traumatized they've been by the fact that they were deprived from space and from air. I've heard testimonies of people saying they woke up in the middle of the night and they just couldn't breathe because there's not enough air to breathe. And that's the most desperating feeling that they've ever felt in their lives. And after that, then they start getting medication in detention centers so to calm their nerves so that they don't get anxiety from being in a closed room. And then unfortunately, they get hooked on these medications as well afterwards. So this is just, these are just some examples of the things that are so heartbreaking and should not be happening.
With your experience, like on the ground, having daily interaction with people affected by it, and also advocating to government organizations, have you guys seen that there are some preventable solutions to like stopping some of these traumatic experiences?
We have amazing community networks here that have gone inside the detention center by providing like a pen pal program, some sort of connection where people can have to the outside world. There are also other networks of support trying to get people out, as many people as possible, through bail funds, things like that, that could help someone not be there if it's possible. And we have an amazing organization in Colorado called Casa de Paz, which welcomes anybody who's coming out of the detention center to give them that warm welcome back into freedom but especially into this country, to let them know that they belong and to make sure that they have a place where they can spend the night if they don't have anywhere to go or if they need help finding their loved ones after detention.
Have you seen that there's any like legal accountability available for those who are having like their rights violated in these inhumane conditions that they can reach out to either complain or file any type of legal action? Is that accessible to anybody like affected?
Yes, there are, for example, we have the ACLU of Colorado who has taken many cases and lawsuits against the GO Detention Center in Aurora. And I would say that there are some resources, but they do not meet the need that's out there. So I would say that this is definitely something we need to be more attention to, because there are too many stories, but not enough capacity from the organizations that are trying to do this work.
Yes. Speaking to that, like the large scale it's grown, people that are being brought into these centers, like I can only imagine that, you know, the resources aren't sufficient enough. Would you say that like legislation change will be like the way to go, or just advocating for abolition? That's been a conversation of like just removing ICE in general because there's no way to execute. How do you feel about that?
Just before you respond, we have a question from the jurors. And after she answers the question for the jurors, we need to wrap up this session, this part. Okay.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for appearing before us. My question is concerning the children of the immigrants that are deported. What happens, for example, with the 3 children that were left behind by the mother that was deported after denouncing a domestic violence situation? And have you any information on all the children that have been left behind in these immigration camps?
Unfortunately, there is no system to support specifically the children that are being left behind. So this would be up to the parent. For example, the family that I spoke about, the children were left behind with the abusive father, and then he had to take care of the children. And this is what I see. Sometimes the primary caregiver is the person that gets deported, and then the children have to find a new home because now they suddenly are about to lose their home. And so it is unfortunate that the children are being the most impacted in this system, but yet they're the least, they're getting the least help and support from most organizations or institutions. I think there is some community support, but I think that we still have much work to do in order to help these children who are being affected.
On that note, we can close this session. I know they're tight for time, but thank you for sharing your experiences today, Laura.
Thank you. I just wanted to wrap up quickly by saying in conclusion that the United States should be a place of refuge for people around the world fleeing violence, poverty, war, persecution, economic inequity. And instead, the US is wrongfully using detention as a deterrent to immigrants and detaining people in an unjust, torturous, and unaccountable for-profit system that is affecting mostly people of color and indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the testimony that we're about to hear now is a testimony dealing with the wife of a detainee, and she will have him on via her cell phone. So she's going to speak to the person who will be speaking to her, and then we will hear the cell phone testimony. If there are, it's a little broken up just a bit, but it's personal testimonies. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sienna Mann. I'm an organizer with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, and I'm joined here today with Christina and George Saldivar. George is calling in from Mexico City, where he is residing now post his deportation last year. So Christina, I'll pass it to you first. Will you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your heritage, and then give us an overview of your husband's case?
Okay. First and foremost, I want to thank you guys for your time coming out here and asking us to share our story. My name is Christina Saldivar, and I've been married to George for almost 17 years. My heritage background is I'm Native American and Chicano. So I'm Southern Ute and Navajo, born and raised in Colorado. My parents are born and raised in Colorado. Their parents are born and raised in Colorado. If there's Mexican descent anywhere, it's 6 or 7 times removed. I'd never seen Mexico until 2007, when me and George did his voluntary departures, what they call it, after filing his I-130, to get his legal status as a resident. His case was denied not once, but 3 times in 2007 under false pretenses, as the American Embassy stated that we submitted false information, which was not true. And I have documentation of that. I was pregnant with our 4th child at that time, and they had told George at the embassy that they were going to punish him 3 to 10 years for making the choice to make a better life for himself and being in the United States, undocumented. George, at the time, we were already separated for 2 months, that we were trying to prove his innocence to the embassy in Juarez, and he wasn't going to handle 3 to 10 years. He couldn't. We were a young couple. We had purchased our home, and I was going to lose the house, become a forced single mother of, at the time, was going to be 4. And George his name is Jorge, actually. We've Americanized him. So Jorge was a man of his word. When we said our vows, he took those to the highest level, and his only job was to take care of his wife and kids. So he returned uninspected in December of 2007 after the appointment we had in Juarez, and I delivered our daughter in April of 2008. Shortly after that, about a few weeks after I delivered her, he hit a guardrail, and he was put into deportation proceedings under the Show Me Your Papers law, which is the SB 90 law we had here in the state of Colorado. We've been fighting his deportation case ever since. In 2013, he was supposed to have been deported out. We had Luis Gutierrez from Chicago, who was a House representative at the time. He wrote a humanitarian letter in support of our case, and that is what allowed George to have a 1-year stay of removal in 2013. And we had won his stay of removal from 2013 up until 2019. Once the administration under Trump had put into effect, under no circumstances anyone is to remain here, was when they detained him in November of 2019, held him for no reason other than him being here in the jail detention facility, where he was neglected medically, mentally, and emotionally. He was starved, and he was forced to work if he wanted extra food. And then after he worked that morning from 5 in the morning until 8 in the morning to keep that facility clean and maintained for the visitors to come and visit their loved ones who are also being detained under false pretenses, because they have, like George, he had no criminal history. They had no reason to have him there. They would rob his bank every night. He would work every morning, and in the evening, when they had the officer turn around to come in the nighttime, they would confiscate everything from their rooms and throw it away and say it was contraband. He was not supposed to have that food. In my point of view, they were robbing his bank every night. So they had him forced labor. They had him just like a concentration camp. They were being forced to starve, forced to work, forced, like they would leave the lights on until 3, 4, 5 in the morning until they had to get up, which means they couldn't go to sleep.
Thank you for sharing, Christina. And the next question I want to ask is, obviously, his detention and deportation has had immense impacts on you and your family, and on him too. Do you want to share a little bit more about like the impact of this? You're impacted by a system that has, detains almost 500,000 people a year. But what has been that personal impact for you? and for your 5 kids.
One. With the question being asked, it's detrimental first and foremost because you're separating a family. Second, you're forcing me to become a single mother of 5. The bills we have are a 2 household income, which is a huge stress. But when you add in the factor that you have a worldwide epidemic, it's 10 times harder because I went without work. I took my children to go see him that they hadn't seen him since November of 2019. He was removed from the home. My kids left for school that morning like no other morning because they knew George had his check-in. He's usually home afterwards. And one of them left without telling his dad goodbye. And he still has that anger, but it's geared toward me because he thinks I took him when my husband did the right and responsible thing to go to the check-in. I've been trying to keep up on the bills because I can't afford to lose my home, especially during the middle of a pandemic. My 11-year-old son started voicing issues of wanting to commit suicide because he missed his dad, because our life wasn't the same. And like I told you off record, I can't afford to take him to therapy. I don't have those extra $40. And the therapy hours are Monday through Friday when I work. So who's gonna take him? You know what I mean? And after you get to the clinic, you pour your heart out to have the therapist tell you, and how does that make you feel? Well, obviously you were not paying attention. I know because I've gone for myself. And it's more torture to try to seek help because then they want to give you medication that yet you can't afford anyways. So the burden this is placed on me has been huge. It's been too much for one person to have to carry on their shoulders on their own, especially when it's forced suffering at the hands of my government. I'm a US citizen. They should not be making me go through this for no reason. My husband qualifies under so many rules and regulations. For them to sit here and tell me that it's not within their budget to review legalization for these human beings that deserve the right to have a life, that most of them already had a life here. He knows no life other than being married, taking care of his kids, taking care of his wife. He knows no other life as an adult. How dare they take it upon themselves to strip us of what we have and what we know, and then to torture our children this way. It's torture. That's what it is. There's no other word for it. You don't allow a child to have a father for 26, 22, 17, 13, and 11 years. You don't allow a citizen to have a husband who takes care of her for 20 years and then say, just kidding. Just kidding. This is not your life to play games with. We worked hard to get where we're at. And for them to force us to be in family separations, for them to force us to continue to fight and continue to pay. I thank God that our attorney has not sent me a bill since November of 2019. But she has continued to fight our case because she knows as well as I do that our government is wrong. The Department of Homeland Security has made errors, and they've allowed the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency to continue to make these irresponsible decisions for our lives.
And so I think we're about to bring your husband on the phone now at this particular time so that we can hear his testimony. We're going to take a pause just for a moment. We will get back to this testimony, but at this time we have to hear from a key witness who is who we definitely need to hear from at this time, who has to leave, and he will be introduced by a recording. Representative attorney from the People's Law Office, Jan Sussler, will be introducing Oscar Lopez Rivera.
We were asked to go ahead and use this time to leave this question for either the prior or the next person delivering testimony. We're wondering about if they can speak to the extra costs and financial abuse for things like phone calls or whatever to try to stay in touch with family, the extra costs that are being incurred when we hear about the deprivation and the poverty that's being caused in the home. And then also alluding to making connections to slave labor for detainees, incarcerated persons, political prisoners, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you very much, jurors. Those was a pre-recorded testimony, so we will make sure we get the answers to those questions for you and have it for you as part of your deliberation. Thank you very much. So is Oscar Lopez Rivera available to come up now? Okay, well then come. And we can put on the Jan Sussler introduction at this time. Please come.
May it please the court. My name is Jan Sussler. I am a partner at the People's Law Office in Chicago, and I have had the distinct honor and privilege of representing Oscar Lopez Rivera and many of the other Puerto Rican political prisoners who serve the equivalent of life in prison in the United States prisons for their commitment to the independence of their country, Puerto Rico. Oscar Lopez was one of those people who also had the distinct, what we could call privilege, of serving more time than than any other Puerto Rican political prisoner in the United States history and the history of the independence movement of Puerto Rico. He was singled out for his purported leadership, and he was tortured and very consistently throughout the almost 36 years that he was held in US custody. He was released in 2017, about 3 days before President Obama left office. And it was not a gift in the slightest. It was something that the Puerto Rican people demanded, as did their allies. And Oscar came home to a wonderful, warm reception as a hero. Since his release, he's been on the lecture tour all over the world. And he's also organized in Puerto Rico on an ongoing basis to continue his efforts to end the illegal US colonial domination over Puerto Rico. I have questions for you, Mr. Lopez, and I'll start now. You and other Puerto Rican independence militants were accused of seditious conspiracy. In the context of the US colonial domination of Puerto Rico, can you explain the significance of this charge and the extraordinary length of your sentence?
The United States government chose to use seditious conspiracy against us, but in 1936, it was used against Don Pedro Albizu Campos, who was the main leader of Puerto Rico, and probably the most dear and precious leader that we had. And also, I would like to point out that in 1950, he was again sentenced to prison again. And while in prison, he was exposed to radiation. And when he died in the most terrible conditions. With my co-defendants and the way that seditious conspiracy was used as an instrument of punishment to punish us as much as the US government could. And we were probably sent to the worst prisons and the worst conditions. And the way we were treated throughout the time that we spent in prison, it was always some obstacle in our way. The first penitentiary that I went to was Leavenworth. And when I arrived there, the minute that I arrived there, I was told that I did not belong in Marion, that I belong in the prison of in Chicago, in the state of Illinois, and it was at that time the prison constructed to replace Alcatraz, and I ended up in that penitentiary. The first thing that I was told there was that they were going to do everything that they could to keep me in prison for as long as they could. So I went from Leavenworth, after 5 years in Leavenworth, they didn't send me right away. They kept me there because the FBI had placed two informers. They were prisoners, but they were informers for the FBI. And what they did during those 5 years was to create a conspiracy to escape on my part that was never, they could never prove that I was making that conspiracy, but it was used against me. And from there, they sent me to Marion, Illinois. That penitentiary in Marion, from the moment that I got there, the staff and the warden made sure that I will not live, that I would be a miserable person, that I will not be able to do the things that I wanted to do. And I spent time with Jihad and some of the other prisoners, but the way that I was able to survive in Marion was always remembering that what we have in our hearts, what we have in our minds are powers, and that we can use those powers to maintain ourselves strong. They did everything possible to destroy me. They did everything that they could do to make my stay in Marion as hard as they could. I would go sometimes from 20, it would be like a 23 hours, 45 minutes in a cell, and I would be allowed out of the cell for an hour and 15 minutes. And year after year, that's how I was kept in Marion. But they were always trying to also find out ways that they could get to me. They, for example, my visits were always kind of pushed to the side, made the visits more difficult. My family coming to visit me was very, very, very painful. My daughter coming to visit me was very, very painful. There were very few times when I was able to enjoy fully the presence of my daughter, my mother, my sisters, my brothers, and even friends who visited me. Their mission, the jailer's mission, and I think that those of us who have been in those penitentiaries can talk about how difficult and how painful it always is to be in the control of them, by their control, and they can do with us whatever they please to do. And one of the things that they could do and they would do was to make sure that I would be put in a very, very sad situation. For Marion, when they built ADX, I was sent to ADX. And 10 days after I was in ADX, the warden came and told me, or told all of us, not only, but he came person by person, letting us know that they were going to be awakening us up every hour. So that meant that for as long as they wanted to, they were going to use this torture to really probably throw us out of our minds, to make sure that we would leave the place in the most miserable conditions.
I'm sorry. Jan Sussler wants to make sure you get to all of the three questions.
Okay.
So I just want,
Yeah.
she told me to keep you on task.
Okay.
Well, okay. So
Let us go on to the second question.
I love you.
Thank you.
And she was saying,
Yeah. Yeah, go from.
Yeah, so focusing on the conditions under which you were held for nearly 36 years in U.S. custody, please tell us how your conditions compared to the conditions under which the general population was held. And the 12 to 5 years.
12.5.
12.5 years of solitary confinement. Tell us about some of the other unique characteristics of your extensive time, that sort of thing, and how that treatment was related to the fact that you were in prison for your commitment to the independence of Puerto Rico. So that's, yeah.
Again, solitary confinement is very detrimental tool, a very detrimental instrument, and it does create a lot of problems for those of us who are the victims of being in prison for what we wanted to struggle for. The amount of time that we would use for ourselves was limited. The amount of time that they extracted from us was quite a bit. One thing that I want to make clear is how a person who's under those conditions can survive. And from the penitentiary like ADX or penitentiary like Marion, they're very dehumanizing. What the United States government wanted most from us was to make us pay for what they thought was a movement that was creating a lot of problems for the United States government. The fact I want to point this out, the fact that we were condemned to as many years as they could. One of the things that they failed to really complete, and they couldn't do it, was because all of us had made a commitment to the independence of Puerto Rico. We were not only willing to go to prison for Puerto Rico and for the decolonization of Puerto Rico and for the decolonization of other places, because we never focused only on Puerto Rico. For us, the injustices that the United States government was doing was painful. No matter where, it was painful to us too. So when the United States government thought that they really had us, we were strong, and we were able to face the challenges that they imposed on us. Puerto Rico's independence, we believe, is absolutely necessary. Colonialism is that tool that the United States government has used effectively, but colonialism is what takes our most fundamental rights as human beings, and that's the right to self-determination and to be people free as human beings, not tied up as the United States government has wanted. And up to 1999, there were 11 extra political prisoners. They were the first one to be incarcerated. And from 1999, two of my co-defendants were incarcerated between 2009 and 2010. And then the moment came when I was able to be released from prison. And this is a worldwide campaign, but the Puerto Rican people, I owe a great amount of love, and I owe them the strength that they gave me. And up to now, I am profoundly grateful for what Puerto Ricans did for us. After 36 years of imprisonment, I came home feeling stronger than the day that I entered the first penitentiary. And I can tell you that the years that I spent in those penitentiaries was always awful. But little by little, I was able to transcend all the punishments that they threw at me. And I walked out of Puerto Rico. I walked into Puerto Rico. I walked out of the United States with a mental condition that was far stronger than when I entered prison. And the day that I arrived in Puerto Rico, I promised myself that I would do everything possible to continue struggling for the independence of Puerto Rico. And up to now, I have not given up.
No, don't go. We have a question from one of the jurors from Haiti. The juror's question.
My question,
So that the
sorry.
judge can hear.
Thank you. Thank you. My question is, when you were in solitary confinement and at any time that you were in prison, did you suffer from any torture, torture techniques when you were in there?
Did you suffer from any torture? I know she has mask on, torture.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, they do, when you are under those conditions, of course, they're going to do everything possible to destroy our spirits. Fortunately, I think that I have been blessed in this world, because no matter what they did to me, for example, sleep deprivation, waking me up every hour on the hour. That's not easy to do. But sometimes experiences help us to move forward. And I had been in Vietnam, and in Vietnam I had to do the whole thing of one person sleep and the other one is awake. And it's supposed to be 1 hour and I'm 1 hour. But remember, when I was told that I was going to be awakened every hour, I said to myself, you in Vietnam never slept 1 hour, probably 45 minutes at best. So I said to myself, hey, you can face this. Then I had trained myself for deep breathing. And when I started practicing the deep breathing, probably in half an hour, I was already relaxed and I felt comfortable. So that was another tool that I used. And then when we are under those conditions, the heart palpitation accelerates because we have not slept, we have not rested. And all of a sudden, I realized that there was a shower and that I could take, when my body was hot, I could take a cold shower. And when it was cold, I could take a hot shower. And that was a way of making my body relax. And it was almost like falling asleep. And probably if I slept half an hour, that was comfortable for me because my body was relaxed, my heart was not palpitating. And little by little, the jailers themselves were surprised because the other inmates who were on the same conditions, probably 3 days after they were in those conditions, they had to be taken to the hospital. I was never forced to be hospitalized. And there was one point fast that I'm going to make real fast. And that is on the 58th day under those conditions, the warden came to me and he said, hey, Mr. Lopez, we are going to terminate, we're going to end the torture. But we are going to ask you to do one thing, and that is to let the people on the outside that we have changed, that we are no longer practicing the torture that thus far has been practiced against you. And he said, if you write the letter, that will be a welcoming. So I asked the warden if he was a man of his word, and he said yes. And right away, I wrote a letter to the outside world, and 8 days later, that letter came on a newspaper from the Nuclear Resistor, a newspaper that is in Florence, in Colorado. And from that moment on, that warden did something that had not been done before. That is, he came to me again and he said, Lopez, we're not gonna hold you. As far as I'm here, we're not gonna hold you more than 2 years. And in 2 years, he released me from ADX per day. Then I was sent back to Marion, not by him, but by the VOP. So, but those things are important.
So actually, the last question from the jurors was similar to the last question that Attorney Jan Sussler, whose introduction to you was pre-recorded, which is why I'm standing here, was asking, had to talk about the politically punitive nature of your treatment and how you managed to maintain your political, physical, and spiritual integrity. And I think you just basically spoke to that. So if you would just want to go on and conclude, we all are very honored here with your presence. I mean, you know, historic, you know, legendary, you know, so make any kind of concluding remarks you want to make. Thank you.
One of the things that I would recommend to everyone in this world is not to allow their hearts to be full of hatred and fear. As long as we struggle, and as long as our hearts and that we have inside us remain strong, we cannot be destroyed. We can accomplish whatever goal we have in this world as long as we dare to struggle for the good, for those things that humanize us, for those things that allow us to grow, that allow us to be in harmony with each other. We live in an upside-down world. We have to struggle against that upside-down world. And the upside-down world is probably the end product of the United States government. And I hope that someday, this world will be in harmony itself, and that the whole notion of wars and the whole notion of destroying human beings and racism and everything that is negative is put to an end. So I think that within us, we can do it, we can struggle, we can defeat the enemy, and we can be victorious. So let's think like that, and we hope that, I hope that soon, one day, Puerto Rico will be a free and independent nation, and that every one of you can visit Puerto Rico, because we're hoping to have an Edenic garden in the Caribbean for those who dare to struggle, for those who want justice and freedom in this world.
Oscar Lopez Rivera, revolutionary, presente. We would like to now have Sharonne Salaam come to the witness stand. We're going to hear her testimony, and we will be bringing on the person who will direct her examination, Pam from the Howard University Clinic, on the Zoom. Okay, you can take the stand there. As we proceed with our testimonies, we're going back to the mass incarceration count 2. We had a little interlude to bring in a portion from count 3, but we're going back to finish out count 2. Okay, go on and proceed, student attorney Pam.
Thank you very much. Madam Justice, your honors, may it please the court. My name is Pamela Quanrud, and I'm a law student at Howard University School of Law, and I have the tremendous honor today to be eliciting testimony from Ms. Sharonne Salaam. Ms. Salaam is the founder of Justice for the Wrongfully Incarcerated and the mother of Yusef Salaam, one of 5 individuals falsely accused of rape in 1989. Through her lived and professional experience, Ms. Salaam is an expert in mass incarceration and post-incarceration. Good afternoon, Ms. Salaam.
Good afternoon.
Great. Before we go into the details of your and your son's story and that of his 4 colleagues, can you tell us for a moment what the main focus and the goals of the work of Justice for the Wrongfully Convicted consists of?
Well, at Justice for the Wrongfully Incarcerated, we work to try to improve conditions for those individuals who have been wrongfully incarcerated. And many of the things that we do and have done in the past has been to try to focus a new kind of energy on those people, because when they are released from prison as a wrongfully incarcerated person who's been adjudicated through the courts, there is very little that is available to them because they are no longer incarcerated. So the services that may have happened, been available, don't exist on a mass level. So they're relying on their family members and others to help to make them whole and put them in a position where they can move forward with their lives. Often some of those people who've been wrongfully incarcerated come out of prison in the same state in which they went into prison. So that means there are some who are uneducated because the educational system within the prisons are not adequate and are not serving those populations that are behind bars. So when they re-enter out their society, if they went into prison on the 6th grade level, they might come out also on the 6th grade level. It all depends on pot luck in terms of where you are placed once you are incarcerated. And once you come out, we're looking to see that there are services available to you that would help you mend your life. Because there's a big gap between what happened to you in prison and this newfound world that you may find yourself in, and you must be ready to fit into that world immediately, on your own. And one of the things that we are saying in terms of coming out is once you've been adjudicated, there should be some sort of information or booklet of some kind that's given to you that says these are what your rights are, this is what you're eligible of. When my son returned from prison, he had spent just about 7 years in prison. He had done 3 years on parole as a, what do you call that? Highly sexual predator under Megan's law. So he was on the highest list. He had not been adjudicated at this time or found innocent or declared innocent. He was still a sexual predator. People were afraid to give him a job because you don't know what woman he's going to look at and rape while he's doing the job. And this includes everyone who finds themselves in these types of positions. Once he had been exonerated of the, adjudicated of the crime and exonerated of the crime, and they became the Central Park Five, that took a long time. It took 10 years. Sometimes it takes people longer because you have to find some sort of an attorney to help you. Once the judge declares that you are innocent, it doesn't mean everything is hunky-dory, move on with your life, you know, everything's gonna be fine, doors are gonna be open up for you. Even today, we get people who are constantly talking about, well, they must have did something. He slipped through the cracks, or what, who did he pay off? All kinds of stuff that still are related to that crime, even though that was a crime where there was no DNA evidence. That was a crime where there was no witness identification of any kind. There was no little black hairs in the pubic area that could be identified that belonged to anybody. This was a crime of circumstance, a crime of hate, a crime of which the judge, not necessarily the judge, because the judge came in later, but a crime in which the prosecutor and the police said, we gotta get somebody. It was an old Stalin technique. The one where he said, listen, we're here and this crime happened. It doesn't matter who committed the crime, but somebody has got to pay. And these kids lived around that park. They were rounded up with many other kids, like a
Ms.
whole
Salaam.
train that went out to get them, and they were put in jail for a crime they didn't commit. Yes, dear. Oh, did she say something?
My understanding is that the examiner cannot hear your responses for a moment.
Oh, she can't?
Right,
Okay.
so.
Should I keep on
keep
talking
on,
my
tell us,
time up?
keep
Okay,
on
I'm
a little
gonna
bit.
keep talking my time up. Okay, now listen.
Ms. Salaam,
The examiner cannot hear your.
Ms.
Okay.
Salaam, can you hear me now? I'm so sorry. There's been a little technical problem, but
that's
maybe you can
perfectly,
hear me
yes.
all right. Just put a thumbs up if you can.
I can hear you. Thumb up. Okay, thumb.
Excellent. Then I'm going to keep myself off video so that we keep the video stream for your voice, because that's the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
I have to admit, I was not able to hear what you just said, but I think you told the story of your son. Is that correct?
Yes, I told that story and I told a few other things, but let's get on to the next question because I got so much more I want to tell. Okay. I think I lost the examiner. Have I lost you again? Let me just say, until she comes back, this situation was a hell for me and my family. You don't know what these types of events do to you until one happens to you. When I came home from work that particular day, I didn't expect to hear the police had come and taken my son. I was so shocked and in disbelief. I said, gee, this is some kind of joke these kids are playing on me. You know, they're trying to get me, just like one of those radio, TV type shows. I started walking around the house, looking in the closets, looking under the bed, looking everywhere I thought he could be hiding. And he wasn't in the house. So I went back and I said, well, what did you say happened? And they told me again how the police had come and had taken my child. And I said, wow, this is some form of kidnapping. It must be. It reminded me of those old slave days when people would come and just take your children and sell them off, or take you and sell them, or sell yourself off. I never really realized how it felt to be in those situations until this happened to me. It's been many times where I look at TV and I'd see children and adults going into jail, committing crimes, but I never thought anything of it. I didn't see it. But when it happened to me, I saw it for the first time. I felt it for the first time. When I went to that police station and I was confronted with Elizabeth Lederer and Linda Fairstein, the DAs, ADAs that were on the case at that time, I heard it for the first time. It was like something out of a movie. I walked in that police precinct and those people walked toward me, but I didn't know who they were. I said to the officer that was sitting at the desk, I'm Mrs. Salaam, Yusef Salaam's mother. I understand you've been waiting to hear from me so that you could talk to my son. Because other people had already been there, and all the police and the DAs wanted to know is if they would give them permission to talk to my son. How can someone give permission to talk to someone's son that's not theirs? This is all part of what happened. They asked me to talk to my son. I told them he was 15. You see, I'm still hung up. When I talk about this stuff, the more I talk about it, the angrier I get. And I say to myself, gee, we need Yusef here talking about this because he's calm. he has dealt with it a little differently than mommy. Mommy wants people to pay for what they've done. Mommy wants people to have accountability for what was done. I developed cancer after this. People walked up behind me down the streets yelling and screaming, "What did you do? How did you teach that child? What did you do? What kind of child did you raise?" It wasn't a happy time. It wasn't a happy time for my children, the sisters and the brothers and all the other children. It wasn't a happy time for us. I was walking down the street one day on 42nd Street, and a police car was parked there. And as I passed, after this time, Yusef had been convicted. And I heard a voice coming, had to be from the police car, but you don't really see the person who's doing this. And they said, "Yusef's in jail, Yusef's in jail, Yusef's in jail." I lived with that. I lived with a time when there was racism and hate all around me. You didn't know who to trust. You didn't know who was your friend. You didn't know who was your enemy, but you had to be careful. Whoever it was, you had to hold still and not yell out, in my case, because I had children at home who were dependent on me. They were dependent on me at some point to get up off that couch that I was balled up in a knot on and go to work so that they could eat, so that they would have a place to stay and the rent could be paid. They was dependent on me.
Thank you.
Prison is a hell. It needs to be, I would say, remodeled, because there are some people who commit crimes. It needs to be thrown out. And people who have had these experiences need to be the one to reshape it, because those people who go in and visit the jails from the Congress and from all these other committees, they don't know what it is when you're going in there. They don't know what they're seeing. Yes.
We have a couple other questions for you, if you would. Why do you believe so many innocent people are sent to prison in the U.S.?
When I saw what had happened to my son, I went to prison, and at that time he was in this place called Harlem Valley, and the majority of the kids there was from Harlem and Brooklyn and places like that, from Harlem Valley. And there were a lot of kids in that prison. It kind of shocked me that there were so many of them, and they were, you know, most of them were Black and brown kids. There were a handful of white kids, but most of them at this particular place were children of color. I met one kid who was doing isolation. He was in a cell all day except for an hour. And when he came out and they decided that he didn't have to go back in the cell anymore, he was so paranoid that the door could not be closed. He would go into a frenzy just being in a room with a door closed. There are so many in prisons, people, children in prison, and their families are suffering right there with them. So many children. I went to a number of those children with the program that we were doing called People United for Children. We took programs into the jails and we saw some of these children. When we saw them and they talked about their conditions, because you have an opportunity to speak to them, no one really wants to hear what they're saying, how they've been treated. It's like you sit down and one of the matrons was telling me how there were children in the prison and they were throwing food around in the cafeteria when they gave them the food to eat. And so you say to the children, why are you all throwing your food around? Aren't you hungry? They said they didn't know what that was. They couldn't recognize it. Someone had told them it was beef, but it didn't look like any kind of beef they had ever seen. Then, as I'm working outside, I saw that there was a school to prison pipeline. I saw there was a foster care to prison pipeline. I saw that there was a medical doctor to prison pipeline. And those were the people who were in prison for the most part, the ones who fell into these pipelines. And if you ask them, where are you from? They'll tell you, I'm from foster care. I'm from this place. I'm from that place. I'm from the other place. But as long as you're just a guest for the day, you just see that particular day and what's happening at that time. You have another question?
Yes, ma'am. Based on your personal and professional experience, do you believe the U.S. criminal system willfully disregards massive amounts of evidence that the criminal justice system functions in a racially biased manner?
Let me just tell you this. One of the things that overturned the case for us, and I don't want to dismiss prayer because there are people out there who believe in prayer and prayer works for them, okay? Was Matias Reyes. And Matias Reyes went to prison as a child, and he became a person who started to believe in prayer. And whatever Christian religion he believed in, because I don't know if he was going to the Baptist, the Ministers, Presbyterian, the Catholic, I don't know what church he was going to, but whichever one he was going to said that you have to take ownership for the things you've done in the past. And when I talk about this, I say it sounded to me like at a certain point, the Holy Ghost. Remember the Holy Ghost they had in the Bible? Raise your hand if you remember the Holy Ghost and how they came down and shook those people's bodies to sunder. At a certain point, the Holy Ghost got into his body and he started spitting the truth out regarding all the crimes. He couldn't stop talking about it. Nobody wanted to believe him. He told the guards, he told the warden, he told anybody who would listen. Once he got into that state, he had to let it out. And finally, he called the press. And they went up and talked to him to find out, was this true? But they still didn't want to believe him. Now remember, I said that they had circumstantial evidence in this case. Now they knew that they didn't have the truth. That's why they kept saying how we're looking for the sixth man. We just haven't caught him yet. Remember that? The sixth man. Well, the sixth man showed up in Matias Reyes and he became the only man. And when he showed up and he told them his story, he told them stuff that they had told no one because they knew they had the wrong people. They had the evidence in drawer number 3 in their desk. It was hiding in there all that time. But they did not want to let go of the lies. So many of our people are behind bars today who are innocent. They know they're innocent, but they don't want to let go of the lies, because there's no way to hold them accountable when they lie. They don't go and finish serving out the cell time for the person that they incarcerated. They don't have to go and pay a penalty because they did this, and most times they do it deliberately. We are the ones who are paying the penalty. I'm still paying the penalty today. My son is still paying the penalty. Donald Trump continues to say that they were guilty. along with others. He's not the only one. When will it end for us, the innocent? When will it end? We've got to let people know at every stop that there are innocent people in jail. Quite a few of them come out of jail every month. We hear about those people released from death row, serving 25 years. After serving 10 years, they come out of jail, and that bond or whatever has happened to them in jail, sometimes it cannot be rebuilt. It cannot be undone. Look at the little boy that was on jail out on Rikers Island for a crime that never went nowhere. He never went to trial. At a certain point, was it 2 years, 3 years, he was let out of jail, and soon after that, he committed suicide. Who pays for the damage that's being done to our loved ones? The only reason it's happening is because they feel we are worthless people in this society. We have no power to change it. And for those of us who have a voice, who have some power, who have some strength, we have to move forward and shout from the rooftop about the innocent people in jail. And there are quite a few of them. Quite a few of them. Because there's a need to have people in jail. Because for everybody that's incarcerated, somebody is making money off of it. They are not making money off of rehabilitation. That's why they started 3 strikes, you're out. They didn't start 3 strikes and we'll give you another break. We're going to give you a college education. We're going to give you a job when you get out. We're going to give you housing when you get out. We're going to figure out how to get you a new family. They didn't start that. They started 3 strikes, you're out. And if you steal a loaf of bread on your 3rd strike, you still going to jail for life.
I want to take the time to thank you so much for your testimony and the courage that you've shared with us today. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for hearing. Good day.
Sharonne Salaam, mother of Yusef Salaam, exonerated 5, formerly known as the Central Park 5. We're going to take this time to take a 5 to 7 minute break, and we're going to come back. Even, I don't know if we can get any stronger than we've been. I mean, my goodness, with political prisoners and prisoners of war, starting off with the testimony of Brother Jaleel Muntakim. So let's take a break. Thank you.